lucky enough now to be joined by Phil Perry from NBC Sports Boston, covers the Patriots very closely and has been writing off of this mini camp that we've seen over the last couple of days. Phil, thanks for being with us. Just want to jump right in here. One of the things you wrote on NBC Sports Boston, the headline, the first couple of lines as it relates to Mac Jones, if the Patriots were thinking about redshirting him this year, they have a funny way of showing it. What should we take away from the reps that we saw Mac Jones get at minicamp?
To me, it was about the volume, Carolyn. I was surprised by how much they put on his plate. I figured first-year quarterback, maybe by the middle of training camp, he's had one good preseason game, and then you see the reps really kind of worked up, and maybe he is challenging for Cam Newton, say mid-August. We're already there. He's already getting the same number of reps essentially as Cam Newton, who Bill Belichick said right after he drafted Mac Jones, Cam's our quarterback. And there was a day during this 3-day minicamp where he even got more reps than Cam Newton. And it's not even just the volume, though I think that is important. It's who he's playing with when he gets those reps. He's getting a lot of reps with the first team offensive line. So he's working very closely with David Andrews. We know how important that relationship is between the center and the quarterback. And they've really put a lot on his plate as well. And they've done this with all the quarterbacks. But all 3 days of the minicamp were really focused on working against the blitz. And I think in one respect, that is just an indication of what the Patriots want to be defensively. Like they want to be a heavy pressure defensive team. And so that's what the defense is working on. So it makes sense. But on the other hand, they also want to throw as much as they can at all of these quarterbacks and say, fail now. So that by the time we get to week one, whoever it is that's playing, and it could very well be Mac Jones, in my opinion, you're going to be ready for what you see, because whether it's Cam Newton, who's still new to this offense, or Mac Jones, I think defenses are going to throw the kitchen sink at either one of these guys. And so they're trying to get them ready for that now. I didn't think we'd be here in mid-June. I thought it might be a couple months from now we might be here. So to me, that was the biggest surprise of minicamp.
So even though all the quarterbacks are working to handle the blitz, in your opinion, there was a clear line of demarcation between, let's say, the attention that Mac Jones and Cam Newton was getting versus Jarrett Stidham or Brian Hoyer? I mean, was that line there that it is going to be one of these two?
It was, and it was there really from the first day of minicamp. I would say during the optional portion of the offseason program, during these OTA workouts, there were days where it looked like Jarrett Stidham was the lead guy. There were days where Cam Newton was the lead guy. There were days where Mac Jones was, getting some surprising reps with guys that we would assume are going to be starters. But once minicamp began and everybody was there, everybody except for Stephon Gilmore, I know we're going to talk about that in a minute. But once that started, it really was Cam Newton was always the first guy up, quarterback drills or in these offensive versus defensive competitive periods of practice. Mac Jones was always second. And there was a day in there, it was day 2, it was Tuesday, where Cam Newton really, even though he was still first up, he would get 2 or 3 reps, and Mac Jones would get 6 or 7. And that stood out to me because it felt like if there's going to be a transition that happens here, and it clearly becomes Mac Jones's job at some point this offseason, it's going to be, you're going to see Cam Newton not play that well, which he didn't through 2 days of minicamp. Mac Jones play serviceably, but you're also going to see the reps go way up because at some point, Carolyn, they're going to have to give one of these guys the lion's share of practice reps because they have to get him ready for week one. Both of these guys need a lot of work. So you can't split it 50-50 and then right before week one say, this guy's been better, let's go with him. I think at some point, one of these guys is going to get 75, 80% of the real competitive practice reps, and that's going to be their choice going into week one.
Yeah, I think that's a really smart insight because, that time is so valuable and you can really only give it to one guy, especially when they need so much work. But I'm just curious how Cam Newton has responded to all of this. Even, in your opinion, how has he responded to the drafting of Mac Jones? Because I don't want to call him sensitive, but, I'm sure that with the season that he had last season, he is going to be mentally affected by decisions that are made at this position.
I think the season he had last season, I think the time he had to wait to get a job last season, I think the amount of money that he signed for this offseason, Carolyn, I think Cam Newton is well aware that his NFL career is on the line here right now. He did tell us the other day in a post-practice back and forth with media members that he supported the decision to draft Mac Jones 110% because he feels like every team should be drafting the best player available, and he felt like Mac Jones was the best player available at 15. I don't know how much draft research Cam Newton's doing, but good for him if he felt like Mac Jones was better than anybody else that ended up going in the first round. But I think he is still motivated clearly by the fact that they did draft him. So you can, I guess, support the decision, but still be a little rankled by it and feel like, okay, but you said this is my job and I want this to be my job. And I felt like there was a pretty telling reaction that he had to that second day of minicamp practice where Mac Jones was clearly getting more practice snaps, competitive practice snaps. Again, this is a guy who's fighting for his NFL life. And he's seeing 2 and 3 times the practice reps in some of these practice periods go to a guy who just got here 15 minutes ago. I don't know how you could feel good about that if you're Cam Newton. It was pretty visible. You know, I won't call him sensitive either, Carolyn, but he does clearly wear his heart on his sleeve, good or bad. And that's always been the case with him. You know, I think that's been a steady criticism of him, is that when things aren't going well, whether it was Carolina or here in New England, he's on the bench. The body language is bad. A lot of times there's a towel over his head. You know, like that's just who he's been. And, you know, it works for him. You know, it's a detriment, I think, in that case. But when things are going well, there's a reason the entire team feeds off of his energy, and they talk about the juice he brings to practice. And there's a reason why he's so beloved and why he's considered such a good leader, is because he does wear his heart on his sleeve. And I think that day of practice, he was really downtrodden. I mean, he had no energy, especially after we were seeing Mac Jones get all of these plays under his belt while Cam Newton watched. He would watch, hands on his hips. He really was standing by himself. He wasn't talking to coaches. He wasn't talking to other players. And that juice was just not there. Now, to his credit, he came back the next day. He had his best day of minicamp practice. He was energetic throughout. And so I think the Patriots coaching staff, Bill Belichick in particular, will take that into account. And if he can string good days together, I think there's a really good chance he's the Patriots starter week 1. I just don't know if he's at the right place in his career to be able to have those kinds of consistent performances when the competition really gets ratcheted up.
It is early, like you wrote. Guys are still in shorts. I mean, there's a little bit of time, even though it almost feels like we're right up against everything with how delayed everything's been over the last year. But so in your mind, this is very much, for lack of a better term, a quarterback competition at this point in time for who the starter is going to be for the Patriots.
I do. To me, it's up in the air. I would maybe say that if you had to put a percentage on it, that Cam Newton, 51%, in my opinion, has the chance to be the starter week 1. And I would give him the slight edge because of the experience and because when the pads come on, we don't know how Mac Jones is going to react. That gives you a whole nother wrinkle as a quarterback when the threat of actually getting hit is present. And so Cam Newton has handled that for a long time. He has a lot of experience seeing NFL defenses that Mac Jones just doesn't. They're both still very new to this Patriots offense, and I don't think Cam Newton really has all that much of a head start as far as that goes. I know he was with the team all last year, but I think even he would acknowledge his understanding of the offense, the way Josh McDaniels wants to run it, was so rudimentary that they're almost starting from the same place as far as that goes. So I would give Cam Newton the slight edge. But again, if Mac Jones is the more consistent player, I'll just put it this way, Carolyn. Mac Jones was the better quarterback for the Patriots. He's the best quarterback for the Patriots. Of the 4 guys that they have, 2 out of the 3 days of minicamp, Cam Newton was the best quarterback for 1 of those days. If it continues that way, if Cam Newton is really only looking good 1 out of every 3 days on the practice field, that's not going to be consistent enough. And even if Mac Jones isn't totally ready and that he's going to understand everything thrown his way by an opposing defensive coordinator, you would still go with that guy because he's just going to give you the steadier performance.
Yeah, you always have to kind of, I feel anyway, read between the tea leaves or pick up what you can at these mini camps or these open availabilities down in Foxborough. And, you know, whether they're fast tracking him or not, I think it's fascinating what's been revealed with the number of reps that he got, that it's maybe more of a competition than people thought originally. Because you mentioned Stephon Gilmore, let's go there next. Just what is the latest with this situation with the star corner skipping this mini camp?
Well, he wants to be here is our understanding, and he wants to be paid. And so therein lies the rub. He is currently scheduled to be paid $7 million in base salary because the Patriots took several million of his salary from this year and moved it to last year, because last year he felt as though he was underpaid, and he was relative to where the cornerback market is, especially for an elite cornerback. Stephon Gilmore 2 years ago won Defensive Player of the Year. He may not be that guy anymore. He's on the wrong side of 30. He's coming off an injury right now, so everybody understands that, but he's still very good. And he's still very good at what he does, and what he does in particular that is essential to what Bill Belichick needs at that cornerback spot to play the defense that he wants to play is he is an ideal man-to-man corner. And he still is that guy at 31 years old. What do the Patriots do to make sure that he can come in? Well, they could give him a raise. I think the question is on Gilmore's end, how much does he need to get back on the field? Because if he's looking for, say, a 3-year extension that's going to pay him $15, $16, $17 million a year to get him back to where the market would dictate somebody of his skill set would be paid, I'm not sure Bill Belichick is going to be willing to go there. That just hasn't been what he's done over the course of his tenure here in New England. If it's just a bump for this year, the Patriots have plenty of cap space. They still have about $15 million in cap space to play with. They could pretty easily give him a raise for just the 2021 season and allow him to hit free agency next offseason. I think that's probably how it will end up going, Carolyn. But if he's desperate for that extension, if he feels like this is the time to strike to get that last contract for him to finish out his career, maybe Gilmore's willing to push the envelope a little bit more and pull we haven't seen it since Logan Mankins, over a decade ago when he sat out.
That's something that even registers with me. I love that reference.
So, but that was half the season he missed. He was willing to sit out half the season to get what he thought he deserved. Now, there are different points in their respective careers. That was Logan Mankins finishing up his rookie contract. Stephon Gilmore, again, he's over 30. So all of this comes into play, and I'm just not sure what it'll take for him to get back on the field. I think a significant raise for this year would be enough, because then it'll give him another bite at the apple next offseason.
Yeah, you mentioned the drop-off a little bit with him. I don't know how steep it is, and I don't know him well enough to know what's going to be okay for him in terms of salary or what he feels like he deserves. But I see, Arizona being written as a team that could potentially be a landing spot for him or be interested in him. I mean, who has the leverage right now between the Patriots and Stephon Gilmore when it comes to what his future could hold?
I think Gilmore has a significant amount of leverage because of a couple of different reasons. Number one, I mentioned, schematically, if you don't have Stephon Gilmore, you can't be the same kind of man-to-man heavy defense that is really aggressive up front. We talked about how I think they're going to be blitzing a lot. They're going to use a lot of motion up front with their defensive linemen and games and twists and stunts, and having those great cover corners on the back end are really essential to playing that kind of defense. They had it with Stephon Gilmore. Malcolm Butler had a pretty good run for a couple of years here where he was a true number one corner, but before that it was Darrelle Revis. Before that it was Aqib Talib. Bill Belichick wants to have that kind of guy, going all the way back to his days with Ty Law. If you don't have that, you have to change defensively, and I'm not sure Bill Belichick wants to do that. I think the other factor that is important here is that the Patriots are coming off of a 7-9 season. Bill Belichick is desperate to win football games. They just spent a record amount of guaranteed dollars during the free agent period to make sure that they get good and get good very, very quickly. If you lose Stephon Gilmore, you're really hurting your team. You can make the argument he's the most important player on the defensive side of the ball, and the defensive side of the ball is where you're going to be winning football games this year. Whether it's Cam Newton or Mac Jones, you're not going to have one of the best quarterbacks in football on your roster. And so the defense is going to have to carry them. And if they're going to have to change, and if they don't have their true number one guy, it's going to hurt their record. And so I think Bill Belichick may be in a different spot. We may be in uncharted territory here. He wasn't willing to play ball with Richard Seymour on a contract. At one point in time, it was Adam Vinatieri way back in the day. There are dozens of names that we can mention that have been in this situation with Bill Belichick, but they haven't not had Tom Brady before. They haven't been coming off a losing season before in this spot. And so I think Bill Belichick could look at it and say, well, I wouldn't usually do this, but we've got to win. We've got to get back to the playoffs. We've got to win double-digit games, and we can't do that without Steph. So let's just bite the bullet and give the guy what he needs.
Yeah, not having a clear starter at quarterback is obviously a detriment to them when they think about what, they're trying to do or who they need defensively. But I would even argue, too, if you look at Patrick Mahomes and some of these elite superstar quarterbacks, if you don't have all the pieces together in between the trenches, you're going to be in trouble. And I think defensively, with all the money that they spent in free agency, and you mentioned the way that they've kind of revamped their defense, when you look at the other side of the ball and you look at all the changes that they've made defensively, when you were watching the defense at minicamp, what stood out to you most? It's
really, to me, well, number one, it's hard not to pay attention to that cornerback spot without Gilmore, right? So we all know J.C. Jackson is essentially their number two guy when everybody's there in-house and on the field. So he becomes the number one. Well, who kind of slides up to be that number two? It's a guy by the name of Jalen Mills, it looks like, who's a free agent that they signed from Philadelphia this offseason. And I'm not sure that's going to cut it at that position for Bill Belichick if they don't have Gilmore, if it somehow doesn't work out with Gilmore, because Mills is a very versatile player. He's still young. He's a pretty good athlete, but his value really is in his versatility, that you could play him at safety if you needed to. You could play him at corner if you want to. You could play him in the slot. But I think ideally he'd be your third or fourth corner, and then he would be able to plug in at a lot of different other places depending on what you need. I don't think he's a full-time outside the numbers guy. So that is one area that stood out defensively, that you'd be working maybe with a lot more Jalen Mills if Gilmore's not there. I think on the positive end, the fact that they have so much athleticism and they have so many capable pass rushers now with Dont'a Hightower back. They just signed Matt Judon. They drafted Christian Barmore in the second round. They have a lot of pieces that could really make life difficult for opposing quarterbacks. And again, all 3 days of minicamp felt like blitz-heavy days. And so these quarterbacks had a really hard time. No pads. We understand that. It's hard for the offensive line to block these guys at times in practices like that. But it looks like they have a lot of talent up front to be able to make quarterbacks miserable.
You wrote something to the effect that Dont'a Hightower is excited to be back with the team. They did have a number of opt-outs with everything that happened with the COVID-19 pandemic, and a lot of those guys didn't come back. Some of those guys retired. Some of those guys went elsewhere. But Hightower, in your estimation, is back and happy to be back with the group. What kind of contributions have you seen him make so far, or do you expect him to make?
Well, given all of the money that they handed out to new players in free agency this offseason, Carolyn, this might sound crazy, but I think Dont'a Hightower might be the most important quote-unquote addition that the Patriots have made this offseason, maybe outside of Mac Jones if he ends up being the starting quarterback, because that's a pretty important gig. But Dont'a Hightower is the quarterback of the defense. I mean, he is their primary play caller. He is their big brain in the middle of the field who can talk to the defensive linemen, get them aligned at the drop of a hat, who can talk to his other linebackers, obviously, but also is a line of communication to the secondary. And so you'll see him and Devin McCourty, for instance, talking a lot back there and just making sure that everything is settled. And that was something they really missed last year. It was Juwan Bentley, who's still a relatively young player who was in the middle of the defense and just wasn't able to react the same way that Dont'a Hightower will be able to react. And so he brings all of those things to the table in terms of his football IQ and his experience within Bill Belichick's system. But he also happens to still be very physically talented. He made maybe the most impressive play of minicamp where he intercepted Mac Jones, climbing the ladder, leaping, almost like a one-handed interception where he ends up hauling it in and pulling it down, and the defense goes berserk. The guy is still a great athlete. You can use him off the line of scrimmage. You can use him at the end of the line of scrimmage to rush the quarterback. He allows them to be really versatile up front and really confuse opposing quarterbacks the way Bill Belichick is going to want this Patriots defense to do. So he's hugely important to them. He was not at the optional portion of the offseason program for the Patriots. He was there for mandatory minicamp, though, and it sounds like he's really committed to this 2021 season, which is hugely important to the Patriots.
Do you get the sense that Bill Belichick really understands the value that he brings as an anchor defensively, the experience that he has within the Patriots system, and also the physicality, just the actual contributions that he brings on the field? I mean, does Belichick really wax about him the way that he does some players, or have that understanding of how good he is?
Yeah, I think he does. I think he would put him in that category of a Gerard Mayo, who we know he has huge amounts of respect for, and Mayo's now an assistant on Belichick's staff. Willie McGinnis, Mike Vrabel, Teddy Bruschi. Hightower is firmly in that class to me. Now, he's also towards the end of his career, and he's making a lot of money. And in Bill Belichick's history, those guys aren't always on the team come the beginning of September. But I think, again, this is sort of that same discussion that we had with Gilmore. If you want the team to be at its best, are you really going to play hardball with your best players, even if they're making a little bit more than you would like them to, or even if their contract demands aren't what you were hoping they would be before the start of the season? Bill Belichick might be a little bit more flexible these days when it comes to handling players like this, because he knows he needs them to get back to where he wants his team to get back to.
All right. Phil Perry from NBC Sports Boston, covering all things Patriots and beyond. Thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate the time. Great stuff.
Thank you, Carolyn.